Okay, I'm thinking we're getting to the end of what I'm going to teach you for this week, but I just want to look at this next little piece and then I'll push everything to GitHub. So we looked at these things here, and then we looked at type of, right? And then it says something here about weakly typed and implicit conversions, but they could be, you could potentially shoot yourself in the foot with them, right? If you didn't intend to do the conversion or intended it to, so you just need to be explicit about what you want the computer to do, right? And then we get into primitive values, and this is a really good thing to kind of know about primitive values. All types except object define immutable values, and an immutable value is something that mutability, mutation, is something that can change. Immutable means it can't be changed. So primitive values, all types except object, define immutable values, which means they can't be changed, right? Represented directly at the lowest level of the language. And we refer to values of these type as primitive values. So we just open up immutable values to see this. An immutable value is one whose content cannot be changed without creating an entirely new value. Right? In JavaScript, primitive values are immutable. And we could open up primitive values here to learn a little bit more. In JavaScript, a primitive value, primitive data type, is data that is not an object and has no methods or properties. There are 7 primitive data types. So here are the primitive data types, right? So a primitive value, primitive data type is a string, a number, a big int, a boolean, undefined symbol, and null, right? Most of the time, a primitive value is represented directly at the lowest level of the language implementation. So these are just like things like string is something that's built into the language. Number is something that's built into the language. Big int is something that's built into the language. And these are known as primitives or primitive values or primitive value types. And then if we come back to immutable, one whose content cannot be changed without creating an entirely new value. In JavaScript, primitive values are immutable. Once a primitive value is created, it cannot be changed, although the variable that holds it may be reassigned another value, right? So this kind of a subtle distinction, but once a primitive value is created, like 42, right? It cannot be changed, although the variable that holds it may be reassigned another value. We're splitting hairs here because 42 got turned into a string, but then they're seeing that as a slightly different, they're seeing that as a different value. There was 42, the number, can't be changed, right? And then 40, you know, from being a number. And then 42, the string, that's now something different. By contrast, objects and arrays are mutable by default, meaning you could change them. Their properties and elements can be changed without reassigning a new value. And so that's just like understanding the terminology and becoming comfortable and familiar with it. If something's immutable, it can't be changed. If something's mutable, it can be changed. And so objects and arrays are mutable, right? So they can be changed. So if you read that, you're like, I don't know what mutable means, but now you do. And so, you know, we're really just kind of becoming introduced to some of this programming terminology. So you're learning about immutable and mutable. And if you're a little bit confused, like that doesn't make sense about the value 42, you know, and it's really, again, that value is a number. And then if it becomes a string, that's a different value. So it's not that it changed, a new value is being stored to that variable, in that variable. All primitive types except null can be tested with type of, and type of null returns object. So one has to use triple equals null to test for null. All primitive types except null and undefined have their corresponding object wrapper types, which provide useful methods for working with primitive values. For example, the number object provides methods like toExponential. When a property is accessed on a primitive value, JavaScript automatically wraps the value into the corresponding wrapper object and accesses the blah, 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 blah. And then the object wrapper classes reference pages contain more information about the methods and properties available for each type, as well as detailed descriptions for the semantics of the primitive. So we'll see more about that as we go through the course. But that's just a little introduction to primitive values, right? And we saw here immutable, and then we went to primitive values here. And we saw primitive is data that is not an object, has no methods or properties, and these are the primitive types. So those are the primitive types. That's immutability. And then we also learned about mutable here. And then we saw that these are the types right there, right? And those types, string, number, big int, boolean, undefined, symbol, and null. Null, undefined, boolean, number, big int, string, and symbol with symbol in here. Symbols in there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those are primitive, right? Primitive or primitive values. or primitive data types. Those are the types we could use. They're built in the language, and you know, they are immutable. So that's kind of like just, you know, if something's a number, if there's a value that you put there that's a number, that's going to be a number, and then you could reassign a value of a different type to the same variable, right? But that is a primitive. So just understand primitive, and then if something's immutable, it can be changed, and objects and arrays are mutable. So if something's immutable, it can't be changed, and objects and arrays are mutable, which means you can change them. So just some terminology there for you. All right, in the next video, we're going to push all the code to GitHub, and we'll call that week number 4.